Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, good. My name is Katie Dixon. I am with the U.S. Department of Labor, the Wage and Hour Division. I am an investigator with the Department of Labor. I've been with the department a little over 4 years now. We enforce all over the state of Indiana, but I'm out of our Indianapolis district office. That is my base, and we're located just downtown. We moved recently. If any of you all have been to visit us, we were in the Birch Bayh Courthouse. We moved literally across the street, and we're now in the BMO Harris building there. So we have moved recently, but that is my base. As I mentioned, I do represent the U.S. Department of Labor, and we enforce federal labor laws. It is important to remember that there are also state labor laws for the state of Indiana. I'm only going to address what federal law requires today, but it is important that you keep in mind that in addition to following the federal labor laws, that there are also state labor laws as well that you should be mindful of. We do have offices throughout the state, not just in Indianapolis. But we do have investigators in South Bend, Evansville, Lafayette, and in Muncie. So we do have offices in those locations where you or anyone that you know could stop in and speak with an investigator directly. With some of our smaller offices, such as Muncie or Lafayette, I would recommend that you call ahead of time just to make sure that the investigator will be there. Indianapolis is usually fully staffed, but our smaller offices have 1 to 2 investigators, so calling ahead would be a good idea. Okay? We have a lot that I want to cover today. We enforce a lot of laws. I know you all have a lot of questions. So today we're going to focus on the Fair Labor Standards Act, as well as the Family and Medical Leave Act. I hope that you all had an opportunity to print the fact sheets that were provided. We're going to start with fact sheet number 44. Fact sheet 44 is a fact sheet that we provide to every business, every employer that we investigate. It kind of helps to smooth over the situation. Usually when employers find out they're being investigated, they're not exactly rolling out the red carpet for us. People aren't excited to see us. It's rare on occasions like this that we're invited to come somewhere. So thank you for having me. But this is a fact sheet that we always provide just because it gives basic information about our visits to employers and why we are there. Usually one of the first questions, if I call an employer to let them know that I will be investigating their business, one of the first questions they want to know the answer to is, why am I being investigated? And they usually don't like my response because the response is, I can't tell you why you're being investigated. Regardless of the reason for an investigation, we never reveal the particular reason why an employer was selected. Sometimes a lot of times actually, we have investigations where it's called a directed investigation and it's not based off of a complaint. And even in those circumstances, we still can't reveal to the employer that no one in your business complained about you. We're just here because you were selected by our national office to be reviewed. So even in those circumstances, we still never reveal why a particular employer was selected for an investigation. And regardless, all investigations are handled the same way. It's the same 5-step process, and I'll go through the different steps of that process here in a moment. But it's the same 5-step process regardless of whether there's a complaint or it's a directed investigation. As I mentioned, we do investigate complaints. We also are doing a lot more directed cases in our agency. So again, a directed case would be where we would investigate either a particular part of the state or perhaps a certain industry. So for example, we might go to southern Indiana and we might investigate a variety of businesses down there for a week or two and do a strike force. We may decide to do an initiative based around daycares, and we might investigate several daycares in the area. So those would be examples of cases that would be directed and would not have a complaint attached with the investigation. Employers often want to know if they are selected for an investigation, how we would get in contact with them. Generally, I initially contact the employer by phone. We also send along an appointment letter, so I will call the employer to introduce myself and explain what it is that we do at the Department of Labor. I'll hand out fact sheet 44, which gives them more information, and I'll also send along an appointment letter, which will explain our jurisdiction, a little bit more about why they were selected, and it will also list the records that we're going to need for review. In addition, we also have the option to show up unannounced to employers. This is used in certain occasions. I prefer to call ahead of time. Just if you show up unannounced, people aren't ready for you. They're generally busy. They might not even be there. So I prefer to call ahead and provide the appointment letter ahead of time. As I mentioned before, an investigation is a 5-step process. So I want to go through those 5 steps with you right now. The first part of the process is having an initial conference. This is when I would sit down with either the owner or someone who has knowledge of the business to get information about the business. This is when I'm going to ask for ownership information, how many employees they have, how they keep their time records, what their gross sales have been. So this is where we're getting general information about the business, and it's usually handled with an owner or a manager or someone perhaps in human resources that knows about the business. In addition to that, the second step of the process is doing a tour. And when we are doing a tour of the facility, whatever kind of facility it may be, we are always going to be looking for our poster. This is a requirement under the Fair Labor Standards Act that you have one of these posted. It's an automatic record-keeping violation if you don't. So I have a couple extras with me today, if anybody needs or wants an extra one. Sure. Sorry, I was standing back to hold up the poster. If you do not have the poster displayed in the business, it's an automatic record-keeping violation. So having the poster up is very important. If you do not have a copy of the poster or would like an extra one, I did bring some with me today. You can also call our office at any time and we'll mail them to you, no problem. Okay? The next part of the process is employee interviews. In addition to reviewing all the records that we request to review, we also interview employees, and that is current and former employees. Generally, we'll do the initial conference and the tour and any employee interviews that we're able to do on site the first day of the investigation. So if there are employees around, we will interview those employees on site in person. However, sometimes there are situations where the employees aren't around because of the type of business it is, they're out working, and we don't want to disrupt an employer's operations. So sometimes we do have to do phone interviews and mail interviews as well. But we do try to do as many as we can in person. And again, those are current and former employees, and that would be for the past 2 years because we do have a 2-year statute of limitations. So when we talk about the records that we request to see and the employees that we're going to speak with, this is going back 2 years. Okay? The fourth part of the process, and this can be a lengthy one depending on the type of the business, is to go through the employer's records. There's a long list of records that we request to review. Sometimes it's dependent on the type of business that it is as far as what we review. But generally, we're going to ask to see an employer's payroll and time records for the past 2 years. We're also going to ask for contact information for all employees, at least addresses. We like to have phone numbers too, so we can call people. We're going to ask for date of birth for any employees under the age of 18. Federal law does not require work permits for minors. I know that state law does. We just need the date of birth. That's all we need. We'll look at work permits if they're provided, but it's not something that we require. Now, at the end of this process, we will meet with the employer or whoever is in charge, and we will go over the findings of the investigation. This is a time when I do an investigation, I don't like there to be any surprises when I sit down with the employer at the last meeting. So as I'm reviewing records and interviewing employees, if I see something that comes up and I have a question about it or it is an issue, it will be brought up ahead of time so that when we do sit down and have the final conference to go over all the findings, we're really doing it for the last time. This wouldn't be the time that an employer hears about something for the first time. So it's really a recap of everything that's already been discussed. At the final conference, we will again go over all the findings, including any violations. We always want to obtain an agreement to future compliance. We want the employer to address the changes that they're going to make if there are violations. We want to know what they're going to do to come into compliance. At this time also, if there have been back wages for employees, we will present any back wages as well as liquidated damages at that time to the employer. And again, everyone has their own different style when it comes to the line of work that I do, but I think a lot of the investigators in our office would agree that the final conference goes a bit more smoothly when it's not a surprise for the employer and they know ahead of time what to expect at the final conference, that there are no surprises. And those are the 5 steps of the investigation process. Our goal with any investigation is to have it done start to finish within 90 days. That is a standard that I am held to, and that also includes weekends and holidays, vacation time, anything like that. So we try to get these done as quickly as we can within 90 days, though depending on the employer and the kind of business and the violations, it could take longer than 90 days. As I mentioned, we do have a 2-year statute of limitations. That means the day that I step into an employer's business, I can go back 2 years from that date. If we have an employer who is a repeat violator, if we have an employer where we can say that they are willfully violating the law, we can go back 3 years instead of 2 years. So it would be a 3-year statute of limitations. Again, the most important aspect of an investigation is educating the employer and bringing the employer into compliance if they are not already. We also compute back wages, as I mentioned, and liquidated damages if necessary. I'm not sure if it's on the fact sheet or not, but I also want to provide our local public line. There's a 1-800 number on the last page of fact sheet 44, but I also want to provide our local number, and that's here in Indianapolis. It is for our public line. Someone is on this line Monday through Friday from 8:30 until 4:30, just answering questions from the public. It can be completely anonymous. We get employers and employees. We have union officials that call us. You don't have to reveal who you are or who you're with. Sometimes it's helpful to get a little bit of an idea of the industry, depending on the question, but it can all be completely anonymous. So if you're ready, I'll go ahead and give you that number at this time. And that number is 317-226-6801. Okay, so it's 317-226-6801. and that is the Department of Labor Wage and Hour public line. And depending on who has phone duty that day, it might be someone in South Bend, it could be someone in Indianapolis that you speak to. We rotate phone duty in our office, so depending on which day you call, you might get a different person. We try to answer as many calls live as we possibly can. However, it's not always possible to answer every single call. If you get our message, our voicemail, please leave us a message. Someone will return your call. Okay? Sometimes we have people who just call and call and call. We don't get records of just the calls that are made with no voicemail, so it is important to leave a message and someone will call you back. Okay? Do we have any questions so far about being selected for an investigation or the process? Okay. I want to move on then to another fact sheet since we have a lot to cover today, and that's going to be fact sheet number 8. I'm going to begin by talking about the Fair Labor Standards Act in general terms, and then we're going to go over a few parts of the law that are unique to state and local governments. But the Fair Labor Standards Act is the law that would apply to state and local governments, as well as public safety employees. We are going to go over those individuals as well. But right now, we're going to talk about just the FLSA in general terms. When we are enforcing any law that is within our jurisdiction, we always have to have what is called coverage. With the Fair Labor Standards Act, there are 2 different types of coverage. There is what is called enterprise coverage and individual coverage. When it comes to federal, state, and local government, they are automatically covered as an enterprise by the Fair Labor Standards Act. When we do perhaps a private sector employer, we have to determine if their business is large enough to be covered. So we ask for additional information from them. However, with federal, state, and local, it's automatic. We know that they're covered, so it's a lot easier on our end. A few important terms, and I'm going to start using these terms when I speak. I want to go over those right now so that when I start throwing them at you, that you know what I'm talking about. The first term is a work week. A work week is 7 consecutive 24-hour periods, which makes up 168 hours. Now, we will get into a work period, the discussion about that in a minute, but for right now, we're talking about a work week. This is what we look at when we investigate any business, is we look at each work week separately because each work week stands alone. So it doesn't matter if an employee works 46 hours one week and 34 hours the next week. We don't lump them together. Each work week stands alone. A work week can begin on any day of the week and at any hour of the day. We see a lot of employers who use Monday through Sunday or Sunday through Saturday, depending on their business, but it can begin on any day and at any time. The second term that I want to cover is hours worked. In our department, we are only able to enforce hours that are actually worked. We do not enforce vacation time. We don't enforce sick time. We don't enforce paid holidays where employees are not working. I believe the state can cover some of those items, so that would be something to check with the Indiana Department of Labor. But federal law can only enforce hours that are worked by employees. So hours worked is all time that an employee must be on duty or on the employer's premises or at any other prescribed place of work from the beginning of the first principal activity of the workday until the end of the last principal work activity of the workday. So basically all the time that an employer or an employee is required to work. We also have the phrase suffered or permitted within our regulations. Sometimes we have employees that try to work off the clock or take work home, and the employee is still needed to be paid for that time as well. So it is suffered or permitted to work. The third term that I want to go over is regular rate. The regular rate is all payments made by the employer to or on behalf of the employee, except for certain exclusions, divided by all hours worked. So if we have an hourly employee who's paid $10 an hour with no other bonuses or shift differentials or anything like that, the employee's regular rate would be $10 an hour. However, if you have employees who maybe work in two different positions at a company with two different hourly rates of pay and they work different hours, we would take all the compensation the employee is paid during that work week and divide it by the total number of hours worked. Okay? So it's basically an average of their earnings for the week. As you all know, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. There's a lot of talk about that changing, but it has not changed yet. So we are still under the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Now, when we do an investigation and we find minimum wage issues, employers are often baffled by this because they say, well, we pay the minimum wage. That's not an issue. We pay all of our employees $7.25 an hour. Or they say, well, we pay above the minimum wage. Why do we have minimum wage violations? So it's not always that an employer does not pay $7.25 an hour. It could be that the employer didn't pay for all the employees' hours worked during that week. So when you spread out the money that the employee was paid during that week, it might take them down to $7 an hour because they were not paid for perhaps some training time, or they picked up an extra shift that the employer forgot about when it came time at the end of the work week. So that's one example. Another example is deductions that might take an employee below the minimum wage. And we're not talking about taxes or anything like that, but we do see employers who deduct for uniforms, or if a piece of equipment is broken, they'll deduct the cost to repair that equipment. They'll deduct it from the employee. And when we see deductions like that and they take the employee below the federal minimum wage, then it results in a minimum wage violation. Okay? As far as record keeping, I have mentioned that there are lots of records that we do request to review whenever an employer is selected for an investigation. I do want to say that as far as the format or the style of those records, there's no requirement for that. We always have an investigator who tells the story that she investigated a restaurant and a bar, and whenever she asked for their time records, he handed her, the employer did, he handed our investigator a vodka box. And people don't normally hand us those in investigations. So she was a little baffled, but she sat down with the vodka box, and inside the vodka box were just a bunch of cocktail napkins. And I have a hard time believing this, but she says that all of the time records for the employer were written on cocktail napkins, and she was able to do her investigation, so she says, with a vodka box full of cocktail napkins. So it just goes to show you that it doesn't have to be a fancy spreadsheet. Employers are not required to have a time clock, although some choose to. It's whatever works best for an employer and whatever is going to be the most true and accurate for that employer. So there's no particular fashion for the records. I know I mentioned date of birth for minors. Again, it could be written on a Post-it note. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, and like I said, we do not require work permits. We would just need the date of birth for the minor. Now I want to go over some of the unique aspects of the Fair Labor Standards Act with regards to state and local government. And this is what is on fact sheet number 8 that I had you all pull out. So if you haven't done that, if you would grab that, and then we'll go over that a little bit. Do we have any questions on anything so far? Okay. What I think is perhaps the biggest difference in regards to state and local government and the Fair Labor Standards Act is the whole idea of comp time in lieu of overtime. We go to a lot of private sector employers. Well, not a lot, but there have been occasions when we go in to investigate them, and they think that they're entitled to comp time as well. And imagine they're surprised when they're not entitled to comp time. But this is a unique aspect of the Fair Labor Standards Act for state and local government. And this is comp time hours in lieu of overtime payment. And basically, for each overtime hour that an employee works, they would get an hour and a half of comp time. For employees engaged in fire and police activities, they may accrue up to 480 hours of comp time, and any hours worked after that time, any overtime would have to be paid to the employee. For employees and other activities within state and local government who are not police or firemen, it would be 240 hours of comp time. Before the work is performed, there needs to be an understanding that an employee will be given comp time in lieu of overtime. This doesn't have to be any sort of written agreement, although it would probably be better if it was. But there has to be the understanding before the work is performed that comp time will be paid in lieu of overtime. In addition, employees must be permitted to use their comp time unless otherwise doing so would disrupt the operations of the agency. And I reread the regulations before I came here today, and of course, when it says unruly disrupt the operations, it's very gray, and all it says is that inconvenience is not an excuse. So this is a situation where every situation is going to be different in regards to whether or not it would unruly disrupt the operations of the employer. At the time of termination, an employee must be paid the higher, and again, this is for any remaining comp time that's on the books for the employee. But when the employee ends their employment with whoever they are working for, they must be paid the higher of either their final regular rate of pay or the average regular rate during his or her last 3 years of employment, and that's for any comp time that's remaining on the books. Okay? Do we have any questions as far as comp time? Yes. You could make it less. The federal government just puts a cap on how far you can go. You can certainly, set that cap lower if you wish, but this is the federal guideline for as high as you can go. And then any hours worked, overtime hours worked at that point would need to be paid. Yes.
This is concerning holiday comp day. Our jailers, sheriff deputies, and dispatchers, if they work the holiday, say Christmas, they get double time.
Okay.
But then they also get a comp holiday time that they can take any time.
Okay.
But the ones that don't, that are dispatchers and sheriffs and et cetera, are not working Christmas, they also get the holiday comp.
Okay.
Is that correct policy?
I think what's important to remember is that we only enforce hours worked. And I think that sometimes hours that are not worked can count towards comp time in certain situations. And we would only be concerned with hours that are actually worked going into the comp time bank. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes.
As an employer, do we have the right to tell the employee that they have to use comp time in lieu of vacation time, sick time, or any other paid time that they have coming to him, to use that first?
Is that one of your policies currently?
Well, we actually just revamped our personnel policy, and we actually stated that the employee has to use comp time prior to sick time. We have tons of employees arguing that point. We actually even have one of our attorneys saying that we can't do that.
Okay.
But I would just, I just wondered, since it was paid time coming to them,
Right.
Why would we want them to build comp time up and have to pay it out when they terminate their employment versus paying that ahead of paid time for vacation or sick?
And I'll have to check on that as far as our current enforcement policy with that, because we do not enforce vacation time. We only enforce hours that are worked. I would want to say that you could require them to take the comp time, but let me double check on that for you and make sure I get your contact information when we're done so I can get that answer to you.
Is there a fact sheet for comp time that we can get off the website maybe?
I believe there's another fact sheet that speaks specifically to state and local government. It would address comp time on that sheet.
Do you happen to know what number that would be?
I'm sorry?
Number?
I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I will get that and I'll provide it to Ms. Gibson.
Okay.
Where would a county coroner lie as far as comp time? Would they be considered law enforcement?
A county coroner. Is that
Coroner.
someone who is elected into the position then?
Yes.
They would probably, I believe we would not have an employee-employer relationship for the coroner, so they would probably be exempt
Thank you.
from that. But I will double check that as well.
Okay, thank you.
What about the coroner deputies, underneath the coroner?
I'll look into that and I'll get you all an answer for sure.
Is that 240 per year or maximum forever on comp time?
That's
hours?
maximum on the books at any time.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Should we be holding our sheriff's department to the rule about the 28 days? We've been making them follow the 40-hour rule, and if they worked over 40 hours in a week, we give them either overtime or
Okay.
comp at time and a half. Does this rule in Section 7K supersede our policy of that?
You're talking about the work period?
Yes.
Let's talk about that right now. That was going to be the next thing we were going to discuss. So what I consider perhaps the second major difference or unique aspect with state and local government is that for police and fire, they have the option of using a work period for overtime in lieu of a work week. So with private sector employers, they can only use the work week. That's what we use. But when it comes to state and local police and fire, they can use a work period. The work period can be 7 consecutive days to 28 days in length. So it's whatever they decide to use as long as they stick to it. So for 28 days, The maximum for fire protection is 212 hours, and for law enforcement, it would be 171 hours. There's an entire table within the regulations, I believe that would also be on our website, that lists the different amount of work period days and the corresponding hours. And basically, once an individual would work beyond that amount of hours in that time, any time after that would be considered overtime. So if you choose whatever work period that you do, this is what you should follow. If you want to continue to use the work week and pay overtime after 40 hours, you can certainly do that as well. Did you have a question back there?
Yeah, I had a question a while ago. We have a highway worker that has 400 and some hours of overtime or comp time. So do we need to pay him that out and he needs to hold the 240 that he has?
I'm sorry, what does this employee do? Are they fire?
A highway worker.
A highway worker? And they have how many hours of comp time?
What has he got? 400 and something.
Oh, yeah. That's a little over the 240, so that would need to be, that needs to be paid out.
So we need to pay them out when we go back, address that with the commission.
Right. After 240 hours, if the employee works any overtime, it needs to be paid out to them at time and a half. So they shouldn't go over 240.
Unless they're police or fire.
Correct. If they're police or fire, then they can go up to 480 hours of comp time. For everyone else within state and local government, the limit is 240. I'm sorry, what was that? 911? I believe they would fall under other employees. They wouldn't be considered with fire and police.
What about EMS workers?
EMS would also fall in with fire and policemen. And I believe that's on the fact sheet as far as the characteristics of those employees. So if you have an individual who you're wondering if they fit into that category and if they can accrue up to 480 hours, I would refer you to this fact sheet. It gives specific examples of what their duties would be, what they're trained in, what their qualifications are, et cetera. So this is a good reference to have. Any other questions? Okay. Sure.
If the law enforcement works like 2 weeks at a time, but they have different, 1 week they might work like 71 hours and then 86 or 92, if they don't have a change in their pay for every 2 weeks, on like the 71-hour weeks, if we did overtime, would they not get paid anything between 71 and 86 hours? If they worked, or would they get paid like straight time until they hit 86 hours and then overtime?
I don't think I understand your question. So what is the work period that you all are using?
Well, they work 4 days on, 2 days off.
Okay.
So every 2 weeks is different.
Okay.
The lowest work period equals 71 hours. The highest equals 92.
Okay.
So during the week when they work 71, they get the same amount of 2-week pay as they do when they would work like a full 80 hours, or actually 86 hours. So between the 71 hours and the 86 hours, would they get any kind of pay since they don't have a decrease in pay for working 71 versus 86?
It would, again, all depend on what the specific work period is that you all are using. I know that their schedule fluctuates every 2 weeks, but you still have to define what your work period is that you're using for overtime. So it all depends how many total hours they work during whatever work period you all choose to use.
Well, each work period would be different. It would be like a 3-week a 3 pay period rotation?
The work period is something that when you select it, it doesn't change. So if you use a 28-day work period, for example, it's always 28 days.
Okay, so currently they're doing 28, but we're wanting to do 14
Okay.
to pay it out. So the 71 hours would be a 14-day work period, and then the 96
Is
or
this for-
92 would be a 14 also. It just depends on their rotation.
Is this for fire or law enforcement?
Law enforcement.
Okay. So for law enforcement, for 14 days, it would be 86 hours for law enforcement.
Right, but for the work period when their rotation falls that they're only scheduled at 71 hours, from 71 to 86, do they not get straight time? Or do they just work it, and then if they hit 86, then they get overtime?
For that work period, if they only worked 71 hours, they would just be due pay for the hours that they worked.
Okay, so what if they work 75?
If they work 75, then they would be due overtime for those additional hours. Or no, wait, it's 86 hours. So if they work 75 hours, they would just need to be paid for the 75 hours that they worked. Because they're not going
So
over.
they would get straight time for those 4 extra hours?
Right, because they're
Okay.
not going over the 86-hour limit for the 14-day work period for law enforcement.
Okay, thank you.
If they are unionized, their union might say something different, and it might require more than what we can enforce. This is just the federal standard, so again, the union might require more, so that's something to look into and keep in mind also. Okay.
Our policy says that if you're an exempt employee, such as a department head, not somebody who is an elected official, but somebody who is an appointed position, that they do not get comp time unless they have worked more than 50 hours. So it'll be 100 hours, because we get paid biweekly, so it'd be like, 50 hours a week before they would get comp time. They don't get overtime pay, it's just given as comp time. And if that's in our policy, is that okay?
This is an appointed official?
Yes,
So they're
they
not
are
elected,
appointed,
but
right,
the
they're not
elected
elected, they're
official
appointed.
appoints them. Usually, we do not have an employee-employer relationship for those individuals, so this would not apply to them.
Okay.
And I can get you more information on that if you'll give me your contact information afterwards. But if we don't have an employee-employer relationship, then what you are doing is basically above what you need to do, so that's fine. Any other questions? Okay, we're going to switch gears a little bit, and I want to talk about FMLA for a little bit. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for FMLA. And this is going to be covered on fact sheet 28. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that when we're doing a Fair Labor Standards Act investigation, that we never reveal the reason why an employer is selected for that particular investigation. Well, with the Family and Medical Leave Act, it's a little bit different. Because the law is so specific to a particular employee, we usually have to have a complainant, and we have to have permission to use that complainant's name. So generally, with Family and Medical Leave Act investigations, the employer will know ahead of time that there was a complaint filed by such and such employee. So they will know specifically the reason for a Family and Medical Leave Act investigation. Now, we are doing more Family and Medical Leave Act investigations of employers just overall not looking at just one particular individual and their time with FMLA, but looking at the employer overall. So we do have some of those. However, I would say at least the majority of the investigations that I've done under FMLA, there have been a complaint attached with that investigation. As I mentioned, if we have a complaint, if we're going to use that individual's name and the things that they discuss with us, we have to have permission to use their name in order to proceed with a Family and Medical Leave Act investigation. So this is something that the complainant, if they want us to take action, if we believe that a violation may have occurred based on the information they've shared with us, they have to sign a form with our office giving us permission to use their name in negotiations with their employer. So that's something that we do have to have. Now, when we are on the public line, which is where we get most of our complaints, if we're on that line and we're screening a complaint to see if we're going to take it, one thing that we always ask the individual is if they have a union. And if it's an FMLA complaint and they have a union, we require them to go through their union first. They have to at least go through the grievance process. If it's not successful, then we certainly will take their complaint if we believe a violation occurred. A lot of the individuals that we get complaints from in regards to FMLA do not have a union. So for the ones that do, we do encourage them to go through their union first before we will file a complaint on their behalf. With FMLA, as well as all the other laws that we enforce, our agency, we are neutral fact finders. We do not represent the complainant. We don't represent the employer. We represent whatever law it is that we're enforcing at the time. We realize when we take family medical leave complaints and when we talk to the complainant that often at times we're only getting half of the story. So we keep that in mind as we proceed with the investigation. Now, with any law that we enforce, we have to have coverage. With Family Medical Leave Act for state and local and federal government, coverage is automatic for those agencies. So we automatically have coverage. We don't have to ask them how many employees they have. They're automatically covered under the Family and Medical Leave Act. So the FMLA applies to their business. If we have a covered employer, the next thing that we would check is to make sure that whatever employee is in question, that they are in fact eligible for family and medical leave. So to be eligible, an employee must have been at least 12 months for that employer. They have to have at least 1,250 hours worked in the 12 months preceding the need for leave. And they have to be employed at a work site with 50 employees within a 75-mile radius. For coverage for private sector employees, in order for them to be covered, they have to have at least 50 or more employees on their payroll. That does not apply to state and local government and to the federal government, but the requirement for an employee's eligibility that there be 50 employees within 75 miles of their work site, that is still in effect. The government is not waived from that point of eligibility for an employee. So the employee, regardless of who they work for, they still have to meet all three of these requirements in order to be eligible for FMLA. So if we have an eligible employee, they're eligible to take up to 12 work weeks of leave in a 12-month period for one or more of the following reasons that's on the fact sheet. So I would have you look at those. We always get questions from employers about serious health conditions and whether or not something is a serious health condition. And in our regulations, there are general guidelines for us to go by, but we always go by what is on the medical certification. We aren't doctors, and most of the employers that we deal with aren't doctors either. So it's up to the doctor to make that call if this is in fact a serious health condition. At the bottom of page 2 on fact sheet 28, it goes over the different notice requirements for employers. And I want to go through this section a little bit with you today because this is very important. And when we do investigations of FMLA, usually there might be one or two things that we're missing here for an employer, so I want to go over them. As with FLSA, a covered employer needs to have the FMLA poster up in their business, and this is a very small copy of that poster. So they need to have this on their wall somewhere within their business where their employees can see that. That is something that we look for when we go on site, and we will also ask the complainant as well as any other employees that we interview, where's the poster? Have you seen it? Do you know where it is? So it's important to have that. The next item on number 2 talks about information about FMLA that is either in an employee handbook or for a new employee, it's provided to them at time of hire. Basically so that all of the employees have visibility of an FMLA poster and that they also have it either in their handbook or it was provided to them when they were hired. These 2 requirements, 1 and 2, are what we call the general notice requirements for employers. So covered employers, whether they or not they have any eligible employees, if they are covered, they have to have their poster and they need to have FMLA information in their handbook or provided to their employees when they're hired. So those 2 are general notice requirements. Number 3 discusses an eligibility notice and a rights and responsibilities notice that an employer must give an employee. Again, we went through the 3 factors that determine whether or not an employee is eligible for FMLA. And the eligibility notice needs to be provided within 5 business days once the employer gains knowledge that the employee might have a serious health condition or a qualifying reason for leave, or if the employee specifically requests FMLA. They need to provide the employee with an eligibility notice within 5 business days. This is the only notice on here that can either be provided verbally or in writing. So either way is fine. I think writing is probably better. I think the more records that you have, the more covered and protected that you are, but verbally is fine as well. In addition to receiving an eligibility notice, an employee needs to also receive a rights and responsibilities notice for FMLA, which is exactly what is on the poster. So they need to get a copy of their rights and responsibilities. They receive the rights and responsibilities notice at the same time they receive their eligibility notice. So each time an employer provides an eligibility notice, the rights and responsibilities notice needs to come along with that. And the rights and responsibilities notice does need to be in writing. Now, when the employer has enough information to determine if the leave is FMLA qualifying, an example of this would be when the employer receives a certification from the employee. Within 5 business days, the employer has to provide a designation notice to the employee that the leave will be counted as FMLA, how many weeks or days will be taken from their FMLA balance. This is within 5 business days, and this also needs to be provided in writing. Okay? One thing that I would recommend is if you don't have a copy of our 825, which is our FMLA regulations, some of you might have this in a blue or purple book. Those are older regulations. This is the most updated version. If you don't have a copy of this, it is available online. And you can also call our office and we will mail one of these to you. Okay? So I would definitely recommend that you have one of these if you don't already, because this is what we use when we do investigations. We refer to this. Do we have any questions about family and medical leave?
I do have a question, thanks.
Okay.
I have an employee who wants to take a second FMLA leave
Okay.
during this year. Would I just apply the eligible employee rule here where they would not have 1,250 hours before of full service since they've already taken an FMLA for the current year?
So this is an employee who had one serious health condition
She had
or
one
one
knee
qualifying
replaced.
reason.
Now she's going to have the other knee replaced, yes.
So it's a separate occurrence for a separate reason.
Yes.
Okay. If it's for a separate reason, then you would test the eligibility again. So you would test how many hours they've worked in the past 12 months and so forth. So if they don't meet the hours requirement, and we sometimes see that, then she would not be eligible for FMLA for that second reason. Now, if it was absences for her first reason, where eligibility was also tested, she would still be eligible because it would be under the same serious health condition or qualifying reason. Does that make sense? Okay. So sometimes we have employees, we received a sheet at our training for FMLA that discussed this, and basically it showed an employee who they may get cancer, unfortunately. So they used so many weeks up for cancer, and the employer tested their eligibility at the time that they had cancer, and they were eligible, so they got to take 6 to 8 weeks of leave or whatever it was. Within a couple months after that, they had bronchitis, let's say, and they needed time off for that as well. So again, eligibility is tested at that time because it's a different serious health condition or qualifying reason. Now, a little while after that, something came up again with the cancer, and this person needed FMLA for their first serious health condition, and this is all within the same year. This is all within the same amount of time. So eligibility would not be tested for the cancer because it was tested before. Does that make sense now? Okay. If it's 2 different needs, 2 different qualifying reasons, then you would test eligibility again. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yes, in the back.
The booklet that you held up, we can call the Indianapolis number and you'll send us that.
I'm sorry, what was that?
The book that you held up,
Yes,
we can call that Indianapolis number and you'll mail us one out.
absolutely. There's also on our website, dol.gov, and if you go to the wage hour division, for all of our publications now, there's, it's like online shopping for DOL, except everything's free. So whatever publications that you want, you can pick what you want and how many you want. I think you can do up to 10 for each one, but they will send it to you free of charge. So you can go in, and if you need some posters, if you want the regulations, whatever you want, you can click on it and view it, and it will be mailed to you.
And what was the name of that? The booklet.
Of this?
Yes.
It's just the FMLA, the Federal Register. The number that we go by is 825.
And that will also give us the calculation of how we calculate if they're eligible in that booklet. It'll give us
Correct. It will
exact-
cover everything for family medical leave.
We had another gentleman that was on 12 weeks. He had cancer, and then he wanted it extended. He had never come back to work. Are you allowed to do that?
He needed more than the 12 weeks within a year's time. At that point, we can only require an employer to give 12 weeks. That's all we can enforce. That would be up to an employer. But basically, their policy would need to be applied to everyone.
If we
so.
decided to give him more, then we're allowed to do that.
Absolutely.
Okay.
This is basically, 12 weeks is the minimum. This is what the federal, what the Department of Labor can require. An employer can always give more leave than the 12 weeks. It's just up to the employer. And again, it would need to be applied uniformly.
Can the employer determine that they need to take FMLA instead of them asking to take the FMLA? Like the employer knows that they have a serious health condition and they haven't been to work for a while. Can they like send them a notice saying, we are now putting you on FMLA and you have 12 weeks? Or,
Yes,
yeah.
yes,
Okay.
and you should, because FMLA often has more protections than just regular sick leave or vacation time. So if you have knowledge that it's a qualifying reason for FMLA, then you should go through the right channels and provide the notices and designate it as FMLA.
Okay, my other question is, when they're on FMLA, do you have to, if they have time, should you take their sick days first as a payment if they want to use them, or are we required to take sick days before vacation days or whatever they've earned?
That's up to the employer. There's a section in the 825 that discusses substitution of paid leave. The employer can require an employee to use paid leave first and run it concurrently with their FMLA, or an employee can choose to do that. FMLA is generally 12 weeks of unpaid job-protected leave. So if you want to require the employee to use those days first, that is up to you or up to the employee if they want to do that. And as far as if PTO or vacation first, that's up to you as well.
I knew I'd do that one time. Okay.
Just a quick question. We have an HR department. So if these posters are hanging outside the HR department, does that meet the requirements for these to be hanging, or should I have them in the highway department? Should they be in the ambulance? Should they be in the visitor center? Where do you
In
want
the HR department would be fine as long as all employees have access to that. If you have a website or a portal where the employees can log on, you can also post it electronically as well, just as long as all the employees would have access to that.
We have a 911 employee who's off now. She did not put in for FMLA, but she's using up all her days, and she's not going to be back before her days are used up. Can I ask her now to go on FMLA? And do we continue to pay for her insurance?
It would all depend if her reason that she is off is a qualifying reason under FMLA, and it is, then she should be kind of similar to the question we had over here. If it is FMLA qualifying, then you should be designating it as FMLA leave, just because FMLA does offer protections. Again, we can only enforce 12 weeks. That's all we can enforce. So if she has already had close to that, you need to see how much time she's actually used as far as...
She's been off 2 weeks right now.
Okay, okay. So then it sounds like she has 10 weeks left then?
That's what I want to know. Do we back it up to the very beginning?
You
Do we
could.
start at that?
Right.
That's our call?
I'm sorry?
That's my call?
Well, we would only enforce 12 weeks. So she's already been off 2 weeks for that serious health condition. We would say that that would be FMLA qualifying, and it would count towards her FMLA leave.
So she'll get paid as long as she has days, sick days. We let them use their vacation days, personal time, whatever. Once that time is up, if she's still got a month off, who pays the health insurance for that next month?
The employer is required to maintain the health insurance for that 12-week time period.
For the whole thing, or for her portion and our portion?
The employee is required to maintain their portion as well. So
Thank
it's like they're still employed in a way.
Just like if she was getting a check.
Exactly. So, and that's something that should come in her designation notice and rights and responsibilities notice, is if they are going to be off for a certain amount of time, how are they expected to pay for their part of their health insurance if their leave is unpaid? Okay.